Hi, my name is Glenn McGrew, and I'd like to talk to you today about the issue of school shootings and gun control. And obviously, this is a very personal and disturbing issue for many people. I think that most anybody who lost their child at a school because of shooting, or even if their child was just there during a school shooting, would probably feel very strongly about this issue. So I'd like to talk about it because I think it's important that we look beneath the surface, beneath what the media likes to present, and get to the roots of the problem. So what are the roots of the problem? Well, I think the thing that we need to keep in mind is what caused these children to feel that they needed to kill people? What caused them so much unhappiness? And the answer is actually not guns. Guns are just what they chose to use to express their feelings. The reasons that lie behind the violence committed by these children, just as in the days of my youth, postal workers, were related to things happening here. Unhappiness, frustration, anger that escalated to rage, a feeling of hopelessness, depression. So when you get somebody who is emotionally cornered, it's not good for them. If they're simply depressed, they'll take it out of themselves. But if they're depressed and angry, that is a recipe for disaster. But what causes this volatile mixture of feelings that leads to mass shootings? And I think that if we look at two places, where the child lives and where the child goes to school, we can figure that out. Now, I'm not saying that in every case this is true in both places. I am saying that some of it is true in both cases. Some of it is true in only one case. But if we look at the home and community, and we see the environment that the children are raised in, that can give us an indicator. For example, is there substance abuse in the household by one or more of the family members? Is there physical, verbal, sexual abuse in the household? Those can have a strong impact on a child's psyche and can turn a good child into a very destructive one. Now, it may not be happening in the household. It could be in the community around. It could be certain family members that live nearby. It could be neighbors. It could just be the neighborhood is just a really crappy ghetto. You put people into that kind of an environment, and the vast majority of them will not be able to rise above because they can't see that there's something better, that they can't see that there's a different way of living, that there's a way out. And even if there are examples of people who have escaped poverty, who have escaped violence, they don't really know about it. So they follow the examples that are set for them. They become pimps, drug dealers, and gangbangers, and they continue the cycle of violence. So could a child who lives in such an environment become a school shooter? Possibly. But I think that if the child has a positive and supportive home life, the chances are reduced. Yet, and I say yet for a good reason, if the child is exposed to a lot of violence at home in the form of movies, television, and most especially video games, well, I believe that that can play a significant role. Why? Well, if you think about it, video games are something that parents tend to buy for children or children download from the internet without a great deal of consideration as to whether it is appropriate. Now, people in America tend to make a lot of hullabaloo about nudity and sex, and that's an entirely different subject, but the issue of violence. Now, when I was a child, violence and sex were something that I would very rarely see in movies and television programs. In fact, I could say that if a movie of high violence, and I'll just use Blade 3 as an example, if a movie with that much violence had been put out when I was a kid, it probably would have been rated R or X. Violence was so extreme in that movie. And yes, the vampires did evaporate into embers and ash, but nevertheless, humans, really, killing humans. We're not dealing with some strange aliens. We're not dealing with things that we can't recognize. We're dealing with people that are dressed up as vampires, and kids can figure that out eventually. So what does the impact of media have on us? Well, it normalizes behavior. It promotes behavior. it isn't just used for marketing. No, certainly marketing is a strong presence, but it isn't the only thing that's present. And if we look at what we're putting our children in front of, we can quickly see that we are programming them, we are desensitizing them in regards to nudity, sex, and violence. I'm focusing on violence here, so I'm not going to talk about the nudity and sex anymore. Suffice it to say that when I was a kid, I could not see things like that on television. My parents would never have taken me to, they had far too much sense to take me to these movies. They took me to age-appropriate movies. And yes, maybe the Motion Picture Association of America was a bit too restrictive when I was a kid in terms of what could get into a movie, but now they've gone to the other extreme, and I know that there are more ratings than there were when I was a kid. I am 51 after all. But it doesn't fix the problem that the ratings have softened so that what was once considered appropriate for only adults is now appropriate for teenagers too. And I have to question that. So you can say, well, gosh, when I was younger, I watched horrific things on television and in movies, but I never shot up a school and nobody else did either. And that's true. School shootings are only something that's been occurring within the past 2.5, 3 decades. When I was playing video games as a child, there weren't any video games like Counter-Strike. There weren't any video games where you were committing violence against other humans in a highly accurate visual and auditory environment. And if you were fighting off humans, they were generally highly pixelated, distorted characters that you couldn't, I mean, you knew on one level they were humans, but they didn't really look particularly human. Look at Donkey Kong. Mario Brothers, did they really look that human? No, they looked like cartoon characters. Now we have video games focused on humans killing humans with high levels of violence and blood, and you get points for killing other people. The level of violence coupled with rewarding children is promoting a problem. It's part of it, okay? So we need to start paying a great deal more attention to what kind of video games our children are allowed to play, and the rating systems that are used for video games need to be strengthened to help with this. Now, the other environment is the school. And at school, obviously, there aren't very many people playing video games unless their teacher isn't paying attention. There aren't very many video games being used except for in an educational context. My child in primary, he has a lot of educational games that are used at school, but they aren't shoot 'em up games. They aren't first-person shooters. They aren't people versus people. They're not violent. So that isn't the problem at school, is it? But what can cause a child to feel distress, to feel sadness, to feel fear, to feel anger and confusion and frustration? What can cause a child to spiral into both depression and madness at the same time? Abuse. So what is abuse at school? Well, it's bullying, and bullying can happen at pretty much any school. It doesn't matter if the school is a public school, a private school, a parochial school. Bullying can occur, especially if the teachers are not dealing with it or don't notice it. But I think that if we look at most of the schools where these shootings have occurred, we will discover that the child struck out with violence because they were bullied. And while I cannot say that every situation involved teachers bullying or abusing somehow the children, it is definitely a possibility. If you look at the fact that the pedophiles in the United States and other countries deliberately position themselves in jobs where they have ready access to children, and that can be teachers, clergy, guardian ad litem, who are lawyers for children, counselors, camp counselors, childcare, any position where regularly have access, then children will undoubtedly encounter pedophiles. And of course, there are teachers out there who are abusive, verbally if not physically. In some countries, physical abuse of the children when they're naughty is still acceptable. So we have bullying as a major cause, and I can speak about this from personal experience. I was bullied for many years in school, starting in primary all the way through to adulthood. And I feel sorry for the bullies because obviously somebody did something terrible to them at home and taught them this horrible way of interacting with other people. But at the same time, it did a lot of damage to me, damage that I'm still struggling with. Not so much the depression anymore, not so much the lack of self-esteem anymore, but the issue of the anger inside of me. The anger is still there. And I wish that my schools had been more aware of the bullying and the effects of it and more able to deal with it appropriately. But I'm not saying that a lot of students bully me. It was a minority, and I was not taught that as a child I shouldn't focus on the minority that was bullying me. I should focus on the majority that was either being neutral or was being nice to me. So I spent a great deal of time worrying about that small minority, unfortunately. And it's only in the last 3 years, maybe, that I've come to realize this fact, that I focused on the tiny minority of bullies instead of focusing on the majority. So we have bad things happening at home combined with the negative influence of violence in media, especially video games that reward you for killing. And we have the abuse, the bullying at school. Now, you take a child who is sensitive, and some children are more sensitive than others, and if you think that all children should be equally unsensitive, you probably shouldn't be a parent. If you think that all children should just suck it up and deal with it, you probably shouldn't be a parent. If you think that smacking your child around is going to produce character, you probably shouldn't be a parent, because the smacking around can have very deleterious effects on your children. So please don't have children if you think that this is okay. When you combine these factors, you produce basically a child that is not only waiting to explode, but has learned the tools and techniques necessary to succeed in getting revenge. Now, I have kind of avoided this till this point in the video, but we need to talk about gun control. This has been an issue that I've thought about a lot over the years, and I'm aware that in some countries that gun control has been in place basically forever. Like, I spent 15.5 years in Indonesia, and what I saw was that Indonesia, accepting police officers in the military, does not allow people to possess firearms. So the number of crimes committed involving firearms is low. Yes, criminals do get a hold of firearms, but they're not as open about using them, or not as willing to use them, because they can get in trouble just for having them. What I've seen is basically countries that have always prevented the average citizen from having guns have a low rate of gun crime. Countries that have a lot of guns, like America, have a lot of problems with gun crime, but you should research this yourself, and you should avoid highly biased sources. I would not trust Wikipedia. You may use Wikipedia to find resources, but I would not trust what Wikipedia puts up there, because anybody can edit it, and that means it can change daily, hourly, minute. The point here is that we can ban guns, and maybe it's a good idea to ban machine guns and assault rifles, automatics and semi-automatics, because really, in a normal situation, under what circumstances are you actually going to need such weapons? I can't really say, aside from defense against a mob or an invasion by a foreign nation or a terrorist organization, or defense against a homegrown organization, which is a far greater threat than the terrorists, and finally dealing with a corrupt government. I can't really say that there is a need for citizens to possess such weapons. So why should children be able to get access to them? Well, they shouldn't. But here's the problem. There are adults who have no compunction about selling these weapons to kids. It's going to be hard if we don't restrict access to these kinds of things. But I don't believe that banning all guns is going to be the solution. Why? Because it's not part of the problem. The problem isn't being caused by these guns. The killing is being performed with weapons, yes. But why are they taking these weapons into school? Why do they buy them? Why do they find these amoral people who sell them the guns? Because of violence at home and or violence at school, plus video games and other sources that promote violence and reward violence. I think that if you really want school shootings to stop, you need to look very seriously at your own home and at the video games your children are playing and the TV shows and the movies that your children are watching. And also, you need to look at yourself in the mirror, at your own behavior. Are you presenting them with a good role model, or are you presenting a role model that encourages bad behavior, that encourages drug use? And when I say drugs, I include alcohol. It doesn't matter whether it's legal or not. Tobacco and alcohol are legal, but they are drugs. They are addictive. Are you promoting violence by allowing your children to play video games that reward violence? You need to look very carefully at this, and you need to understand that the reason I'm saying this is because from the time that a child is old enough in the womb to have a functioning brain until the time the child is approximately 25, some are older, some younger, a child's brain is still developing and is much more susceptible to being changed by stimulus from video games and other sources. So if you're starting at a young age, you're planting your child in front of your mobile phone for hours at a time, the TV, and then video games, you're programming your child to have problems. Why? Because the brain adapts itself to the environment it's in, and it can't differentiate between the environment around us and the environment in here. So when you started letting children at a young age be exposed to screens for a long period of time, you're changing the way the brain is wiring itself. It is wiring itself for that experience of screens that are often changing, flashing, and illogical sequences where things are not connected in an obvious way. Now, I know when you watch TV, you say, oh, well, yeah, the screen changed, but it makes sense. I understand why. Yeah, on that level, you understand intellectually, but there are parts of the brain that don't, and they continue to stimulate and affect the way the brain grows and changes. So you really need to think very, very carefully and make some changes in your own lives and work to make changes in what your children are exposed to from you and from media, and more importantly, dealing with bullying and abuse in school. If we can work on bullying, and there are effective programs out there. I will name one. It's called Challenge Day. Actually, when I was in Indonesia, I did use Challenge Day as an inspiration to create a weekend program for students to kind of bring more harmony and unity into the school, and it was very successful. It also made myself and the teachers and principals much more aware of the number of children that were experiencing physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at home. And it was shocking, because this is a primary school, the number of children who were experiencing this in their homes or communities. So I'm going to stop now, but if you really, really, really want to deal with this problem, I realize that you love to have that PlayStation and you think it's fun to play with your child, but you better be careful about which games you choose to play with your child. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that this will make a difference.